Hello and welcome to Covenant Theology Part 1. Over the next 8 weeks, we are going to be studying this topic together during this intensive course. Before we get started, since this is our first day together, let me introduce myself to anyone who may not be too familiar with me. My name is Natalie Kendel. I am a theologian and director and head lecturer at Zeteo School of Theology. My educational background includes a BA and MA certificate in theology with a focus on systematic theology. In today's introductory class, we will be looking at the following. We'll have an introduction to covenant theology. What is it? Why does it matter? We'll have an overview of what this course will cover, and we'll conduct a text study during which we'll begin looking at the first 3 chapters of the book of Genesis. First of all, let's begin with the first part of our introduction today. What is covenant theology? Covenant theology is a branch of the methodology called biblical theology. So to understand what covenant theology is, we must first understand what biblical theology is. As mentioned, biblical theology is a theological method, a method of interpreting or reading the Bible. It is one I've chosen to specialize in, and I'll tell you why I chose it in a moment. But first, let's break this down further. What is a methodology? A methodology is a way to approach something. It's basically a set of rules or a framework. A silly example is if I try to use the method of poetry interpretation in order to solve a math problem, I'm going to end up with a bit of nonsense. Why? Because I'm using the wrong methodology, the wrong rules. It would be like me trying to speak Swedish in Brazil and then expecting everyone to understand me. Poetry is like one language, math is another language. So, in short, biblical theology is a method, a language or a lens through which to view the Bible's whole story. And what you end up reading and what you get out of it is going to be determined by your reading method, whether you're aware of what your methodology is or not, whether you're aware that you have a methodology or not. The language we choose or the method we apply is going to affect how we understand the Bible, how we understand God, and what sort of faith we end up with. Some may ask, why do we need a method? Can't I just read the Bible and get something out of it that way? Well, you can, and you might very well get something out of it. But just like deeper relationships are only formed when we are deliberate and are responsible in our approach, so a deeper, better understanding of the text happens when we are deliberate and understanding of how we read it. So, I mentioned I would explain why I've chosen to specialize in biblical theology. Why did I choose biblical theology over, say, other methodologies? After all, you can come at the Bible from so many different angles. You can look at it through the lens of science, historical perspective. You can apply a lens of social ethics or read it like a book of moral teachings. But who is to say which is best? Well, biblical theology's brilliant rule is as follows. Why don't we let the Bible tell us the language we should read it in? So instead of us using our subjective methods of understanding and purely biased opinions, let's listen to what method the Bible is suggesting we use. Because the Bible is using its own language to speak. It has already chosen the method for us, and this method is the language of narrative, the language of story. If the Bible has been written as a narrative, then shouldn't our reading method reflect that? And this brings us to why I chose this method. Biblical theology allows space for the Bible to dictate the terms and decide how we're going to read it. Biblical theology maintains, let the Bible speak for itself. So, where does covenant theology come into all this? As we mentioned, covenant theology is a branch of biblical theology. If you've decided to let the Bible choose your reading method for you, which in this case we call the biblical theology method, then how do you understand this collection of narratives? Why is the Bible important if it's just a bunch of stories scattered about? One about Adam, one about a guy called David, one about Job. What do any of these stories have to do with each other or with us? What is the point of them all? Well, it turns out that all these Bible stories scattered throughout this strange book are actually tied together. It's not a random mess. Biblical theology argues that the Bible has clear forward movement. The stories are actually all connected. It's one unified narrative, and it's all moving towards something. Now, most of the time when I ask people, what is the Bible about? The most common answer is, it's about salvation. And by saying this, they tend to mean my salvation, my personal salvation. But what happens if you believe the Bible is all about you being saved and your salvation? Well, it all becomes very human-centered and very me-centered. You might start to think that the point of all these stories was so that you could sit one morning in your kitchen drinking coffee and through some magic of osmosis be saved because you're reading the words Jeremiah wrote on a cowskin scroll in a dusty hut thousands of years ago. The problem with saying the Bible is about salvation or my salvation is that it's so much bigger than that, to the point where your salvation is a wonderful byproduct of what's happening in the narrative. And this is something which can be very confusing or strange to a 21st century audience. I realize that this may sound radically different from what some of us may have been told and taught, but we're going to see in this class how the Bible's stories are connected into one big story, a grand narrative, because of one person. And he has many names. The Bible says this person is God. In contrast to the Bible, humanity has always told world history from the perspective of themselves, as though it is what we say and what we do which drives the story forward. We view ourselves as the initiators. We see ourselves as the center and movers of the world and history. But in the Bible, something else is happening. It seems to be not us, but God who is driving the story forward. And so instead of saying the Bible is about me being saved, it would be more accurate to say that the Bible story is promise-driven. And it is God who is making the promises. So God makes a promise, people choose to trust that promise or not, and then the question is whether or not he keeps his promises or not. But don't take my word for it. Jesus himself says, The scriptures, the Bible, are about him, leading up to him. In John chapter 5, verse 39, he says, "You study the scriptures diligently because you think that in them you have eternal life. These are the very scriptures that testify about me." If you miss this point, you miss the point of the Bible. So to sum up, God is the one moving the biblical narrative forward through his actions. And we are going to discover in this course that the way he acts is through covenant. So, just as the Bible's language, the Bible's method of speaking to us is through narrative, through story, so God's way of speaking to mankind in that narrative is through the language of covenant. This means that if we are to understand his language, the language he is choosing to speak to human beings, we have to understand covenant. And lo and behold, that's what we're here to do. This leads us to the next question. What is covenant? Although people today still use this word, the original meaning is unfamiliar to many. If I wanted to say to my husband, Derek, I promise to meet you at 11 o'clock, then I wouldn't say, Derek, I want to make a covenant with you to meet at 11 o'clock. I wouldn't put it this way because it would seem a strange, archaic way of putting it. Basically, today covenant is a bit of a strange language to many modern people. But in the ancient Middle East and beyond, covenant and covenant making was part of everyday language. It was woven into the culture as baguettes are to the French and skis are to the Norwegians. The Hebrew word for covenant is brit. Brit refers to a legally binding relationship between two or more parties. Just like we still have legally binding relationships today. You might have a legally binding relationship with your landlord. You might have a legally binding relationship with a spouse, and so on. The technical phrase for making a covenant was to cut a covenant. So you wouldn't say, let me make a covenant with you. Instead, in the ancient Near East, you'd say, let me cut a covenant with you. This in Hebrew is karat brit, so to cut a covenant. In the Near East, you would make different kinds of covenants. These can be categorized into two types. One, a contract. This first type, which we call a contract, was a mutually beneficial agreement between two parties. So a deal would be made at the end of a negotiation. Like Yusuf would say to Aram, Aram, I'll give you my 2 best camels if I can have your 3 sheep. And Aram might reply, Great, Yusuf, sounds fair. Let's make a deal. Let's cut a covenant. This is the first kind of covenant. Now, the second type of covenant is called a last will and testament. And this type differs from the first, from a contract. Because if you remember, in a contract, there is a discussion, a back and forth between two people, agreeing on what each side is going to get and what they're going to give. But in a will, there is no discussion, is there? Even today, it's up to one person saying, this is what you're going to get when I die. And the second party, the person receiving or inheriting things, doesn't get to choose what he gets or the terms of the will, as in the rules or the conditions. He is simply promised things. Now, the Old Testament of the Bible was written in the main in Hebrew and later translated into Greek. And in Hebrew, there is only one word for covenant. This is, as we've already identified, the word brit. But the Bible was translated into Greek because Greek became one of the most commonly written languages in the world during New Testament times. And in Greek, there aren't one but two words for covenant. The first is the contract type, syntheke, and the second is the last will and testament kind, diatheke. Now, this presented a challenge to translators. What were the translators to do as they were translating from Hebrew? Well, they picked the Greek word diatheke because it better reflects the Hebrew mindset and meaning, this idea of the last will and testament. And this detail is important because the covenants God makes in the Bible were defined by God. We are going to discover this as we go through the story. God is the one who sets the terms. He makes the covenants. He takes the initiative. It is not for humans to negotiate or discuss. We could put this another way. In the Bible, covenant is divinely initiated. It is like God taking the initiative to come round for tea, not us calling him up on the phone and then asking him to come round for tea. And therefore, diatheke, the last will and testament kind, is the most accurate translation. So, back to the point. If the Bible is about Jesus, God, and covenant is the language he chooses to speak about himself, then covenant must be the language which God chooses to tell us who he is. Let's just repeat that again to make sure we all got that. If the scriptures are, as Jesus said in John 5:39, all about him, and covenant is the language he is choosing to speak to us about himself, then covenant must be the language God uses to tell us who he is. And this is where we may begin to get a glimpse of how incredibly important it is to understand the nature and central role of covenant when reading the Bible. Because if you don't see the Bible being about God, then you miss its point. And if you don't understand what God is communicating about himself, then you're going to end up with wrong information and potentially a misinformed relationship. But who is God? Big question. Well, if you sit in Sunday or Sabbath school classes or in a Bible study with other Christians, someone is bound to answer that question with, God is love, quoting 1 John 4:16. But again, what does that mean? What is love? After all, the word love is thrown around a lot. For example, there is the issue of love languages. One guy named Bob can express love to a woman named Susan by giving her gifts. But perhaps her love language is physical contact. She might say, but I still don't feel loved, even if she gets piles of presents. It has been suggested that love is a wholehearted, others-centered commitment. But again, back to saying God is love, there are all sorts of problems with just throwing around that statement. God is love. For example, what evidence is there of that? There is a uselessness in just stating God is love to describe him, especially in a world where love is an overused, abused word that people have often lost touch with because it's so misrepresented time and time again. Another problem with saying God is love is people can look at certain isolated Bible stories, like the flood, and other instances of God ending lives. And let's be completely honest, he doesn't seem loving in these stories. So instead of merely shouting out the umbrella statement, God is love, at people when we're asked who God is, let's look at what the Bible does instead. Time, truth, trust. Trust is built when the truth is revealed over time. In the Bible, the time is the stories where things are played out and people reveal their true motives, where truth comes to light. Doesn't the saying go, time reveals all? And so instead of just shouting, God is love, in the very first sentence of the Bible tells stories, stories set over time. Well, in this class, we're going to follow that principle and let the stories, let time speak. To let time reveal what is true or not true about who God is. In this course, we are going to look at covenants God made, how they unfold, and whether or not they still matter. And in order to do this, we need to obviously look at the stories themselves. Our intensive is going to be exploring the following 8 stories or themes. Here is the layout of the course: the Edenic Covenant, the Abrahamic Covenant, the Mosaic Covenant, the Davidic Covenant, the Prophets and the Covenant, Yeshua, the Messianic Covenant, Shavuot till the unveiling, and finally, communion, which will not be a lecture, but a practical, experiential event with music and celebration, the conclusion to our class. So, that was our introduction to our course to help us understand what we're going to be doing and why we're studying this topic. So to summarize, covenant is the way God relates to human beings, the language he chooses to speak in revealing who he is. A covenant is a commitment, making a promise. A covenant, as used in the Bible, is always initiated by God. And today we will be looking at the first narrative on our list, the Edenic Covenant. To do so, we're going to turn to the book of Genesis. But before we dive in, let's have a short break at this point, and then when we return, we'll get started. Right, let's start at the beginning. A very good place to start. Chapter 1 of the story, Genesis chapter 1. As we read through the following texts, I'd like you to keep a couple of questions in the back of your mind, and you can even write down what you find as we go along. Number 1, what does this say about God? And number 2, what kind of God would do this? Let's begin reading from Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 to 31. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was unformed and void. Darkness was on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God hovered over the surface of the water. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. So there was evening and there was morning one day. God said, "Let there be a dome in the middle of the water. Let it divide the water from the water." God made the dome and divided the water under the dome from the water above the dome. That is how it was. And God called the dome sky. So there was evening and there was morning, a second day. God said, "Let the water under the sky be gathered together into one place, and let dry land appear." So that is how it was. God called the dry land earth. The gathering together of the water he called seas. And God saw that it was good. God said, "Let the earth bring forth grass, seed-producing plants, and fruit trees, each yielding its own kind of seed-bearing fruit on the earth." And that is how it was. The earth brought forth grass, plants, each yielding its own kind of seed, and trees, each producing its own kind of seed-bearing fruit. And God saw that it was good. So there was evening and there was morning, a third day. God said, "Let there be lights in the dome of the sky to divide the day from the night. Let them be for signs, seasons, days, and years. And let them be for lights in the dome of the sky to give light to the earth." And that is how it was. God made the two great lights, the larger light to rule the day, and the smaller light to rule the night, and the stars. God put them in the dome of the sky to give light to the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. So there was evening and there was morning, a fourth day. God said, "Let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth in the open dome of the sky." God created the great sea creatures and every living thing that creeps, so that the waters swarmed with all kinds of them, and there was every kind of winged bird. And God saw that it was good. Then God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful, multiply, and fill the water of the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth." So there was evening and there was morning, a fifth day. God said, "Let the earth bring forth each kind of living creature, each kind of livestock, crawling animal, and wild beast." And that is how it was. God made each kind of wild beast, each kind of livestock, and every kind of animal that crawls along the ground. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, in the likeness of ourselves, and let them rule over the fish in the sea, the birds in the air, the animals, and over all the earth, and over every crawling creature that crawls on the earth." So God created humankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them. God said to them, "Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea, the birds in the air, and every living creature that crawls on the earth." Then God said, "Here, throughout the whole earth I am giving you as food every seed-bearing plant and every tree with seed-bearing fruit. And to every wild animal, bird in the air, and creature crawling on the earth, in which there is a living soul, I am giving as food every kind of green plant." And that is how it was. God saw everything he had made, and indeed it was very good. So there was evening and there was morning, a sixth day. Genesis chapter 2. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, along with everything in them. On the seventh day, God was finished with his work which he had made. So he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had made. God blessed the seventh day and separated it as holy, because on that day God rested from all his work which he had created, so that it itself could produce. Here is the history of the heavens and the earth when they were created. On the day when Adonai God made heaven and earth, there was as yet no wild bush on the earth, and no wild plant had as yet sprung up. For Adonai God had not caused it to rain on the earth, and there was no one to cultivate the ground. Rather, a mist went up from the earth, which watered the entire surface of the ground. Then Adonai God formed a person from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, so that he became a living being. Adonai God planted a garden towards the east, in Eden, and there he put the man whom he had formed. Out of the ground Adonai God caused to grow every tree pleasing in appearance and good for food, including the tree of life in the middle of the garden and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Let's jump to verse 15. Adonai God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to cultivate and care for it. Adonai God gave the person this order: You may freely eat from every tree in the garden except the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. You are not to eat from it, because on the day that you eat from it, it will become certain that you will die. Adonai God said, It isn't good that man should be alone. I will make for him a companion suitable for helping him. Now Adonai God had formed from the ground every wild animal and every bird that flies in the air, and he brought them to the man to see what he would call them. Whatever the man would call each living creature, that was to be its name. So the man gave names to all the livestock, to the birds in the air, and to every wild animal. But for Adam, there was not found a companion suitable to help him. Then God caused a deep sleep to fall upon the person, and while he was sleeping, he took one of his ribs and closed up the place from which he took it with flesh. The rib which Adonai God had taken from the person, he made a woman person, and he brought her to the man person. The man person said, At last, this is bone from my bones and flesh from my flesh. She is to be called woman, because she was taken out of man. This is why a man is to leave his father and mother and stick with his wife, and they are to be one flesh. They were both naked, the man and his wife, and they were not ashamed. And we're going to stop there. So, this is the beginning of the story of God creating the world. You may remember the two questions I asked you to keep in mind while reading this. I've had other classes before where I asked those attending after we read Genesis 1 and 2, so what does this say about God? And the common answers are God created things, so he is loving, or God is good. But a bad person can make things. Doesn't mean he's good or loving. I don't know if any of you wrote down any notes to answer the questions. One, what does this say about God? And two, what kind of God would do this? But here are a few things I wrote down, some things I think we can get from the text. Number one, he is powerful. Number two, he is creative. Three, he's organized. If you remember him dividing the light and dark, night and day, the land and water, and so on. He is not power hungry. If you noticed, God delegates. He gives power away. Number five, he seems honest. God, when looking at what he's made, isn't bragging, but calls it what it is, good. He is choice-giving. He is imaginative. He is providing. Perhaps you had something on your list which I didn't put down. There is no doubt much more to be gleaned from this text. Now, if I ask a Christian, is it good there's a God? Some may reply resoundingly, yes. But then if I ask, is it good there's a husband? People will tend to reply, it depends on the husband. And that exactly is the point here. As readers, we are thrust into the story in the middle of a God busy making the world. And we are not told whether he is good or bad, although we are told that what he makes, he calls good. But who he is yet to be discovered. In the text we've just read, we've seen the first covenant in the Bible. In Genesis 1:26-29, and in chapter 2, verse 16-17, God has made a covenant with humankind. Remember what the biblical covenant looks like? A brit, the last will and testament. God is the one party who decides to initiate and determines the terms of the covenant relationship. Adam was not brought into discussion as to what he'd receive as a gift. He didn't have to haggle for what he'd be given. He's simply given life, God's image, blessing, rulership or dominion, and provided for his needs, food, companionship, and so on. Now let's pause here for a moment and ask a question. Had the humans proved their worthiness or their capability before they were given these things? No, they hadn't done anything yet. But God seems to make a covenant with them anyway. If we delve a little deeper into some of these things given to them, specifically, Adam and Eve were given God's image in Genesis 1, verse 27. What is the image of God? This question represents a huge discussion within academic theology and has been debated for hundreds of years. But for now, let's focus on the following. According to the story, a central part of being in the image of God seems to be two things: rulership and dominion, and handing over power. Because the story of the world begins with a powerful God, powerful enough to make a whole world. And then he makes people in his image and then gives them power. That right there ought to tell us something very significant about God. And it should get our minds going and thinking about this whole power thing. For example, if we may have a side note here, some people today truly see man and woman as rightfully being in a hierarchy relationship, one above the other. And many religiously affiliated people will affirm a relationship hierarchy idea, which looks like this: God, man, and then woman. But hold on. According to this story, and according to how God works in this story, it seems that even if you have power, then being in God's image means giving that power away. God not only instates this kind of leadership in the world, he models it. He models it by himself giving away power to Adam and Eve. And so, although this is a side note, it's worth considering. Even if you argue man was rightfully on top in a power hierarchy, and that this hierarchy was designed and intended by God, there still seems to be no room for holding on to power. Not if you're in the image of God. And when it comes to gender roles and inequality, we might have to ask ourselves, Are we holding on to what God Himself refuses to hold on to? But that question is for another class. In chapter 1, verse 26, there is an example of Hebrew literary poetry. It is written in the form of a poem. Let's make humankind in our image. Then God says, so they can rule over the animals, birds, etc. And then again repeats in verse 27, so God made humans in His image. Now, this structure is a very common one found in Hebrew poetry. You might call it a meaning sandwich. The technical term is a chiastic structure. Image, then rulership, and then image again. Like a word sandwich, the text is structured in this way as it's meant to bring attention to the connection between these two things, image and rulership. The image of God encapsulates, contains the meaning of human leadership or rulership in the world. But okay, if this is a covenant, as you'd have in a contract, what are the conditions? Well, they were stated in Genesis 2:16-17. God has here laid down the terms and conditions of this covenant with human beings. Don't eat from the tree. A specific tree. A tree called the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Based on what we read here, this is a trust-based relationship because the tree in question seems to be open and accessible to them, not hidden away in secret, locked in a room somewhere. At this point, we're going to zoom in and take a closer look at this whole forbidden tree thing, because this part of the story is juicy with important information. You've likely heard the story of Eden before in some form or other, and of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. In the Garden of Eden, there are two special trees mentioned. One was the tree of life, the other, this forbidden tree. But some of you may have noticed how when this story is told in religious services or pictured in children's books, you just see these two lonely trees standing out there like a sore thumb, alone in the clearing of the forest. And what is often missed is the rest of the forest. Imagine the biggest forest you can think of, so many trees. You could walk for weeks and weeks and never get to the end of it. And not only that, but every single tree is heavy with every kind of yummy, rich fruit and food. And it's all edible. This is the first part often misrepresented in this story. This richness and vastness of choice that was available to Adam and Eve. Because often you get the impression they could pick one right thing or one wrong thing. But in reality, they could pick one wrong thing or hundreds of thousands of right things. They were surrounded by right choices everywhere. Often sin is presented as a big adventure into all sorts of options otherwise hidden away or unavailable to us, with limitless choice. While the right thing is presented as this narrow, singular, tiny thing that's hard to find. But in the garden, sin is singular and everything else is vast. What is wrong is one tiny thing in an ocean of other options. It seems like being on the inside of the covenant with God is richer and fuller and more exciting than being on the outside. In fact, being on the outside of a covenant with him is the option which is limiting and narrow. And this leads us to the second point. A loving covenant must have a door for people to be able to leave. My husband Derek told this story to a class he was teaching. He said, "If I made the nicest home in the world for my wife, if it had the fastest Wi-Fi in the world and unlimited snacks and was decorated to perfection, but I said she couldn't go outside the front door, would I be a monster?" Some people in the class at first reacted, "That would be amazing. I would take that deal. I'm okay with that." But then Derek expanded on it. He said, "Really? If I said, Nat, you're forbidden to leave the house and you may not go out the front door." And then it started to sink in. Oh no, that wouldn't be good. This is to illustrate the following point. It doesn't matter how beautiful a covenant is, how beautiful a relationship is. If one party doesn't have the option to leave, it isn't loving. Because love is dependent on choice. If you're forced to stay, it doesn't matter how nice your prison is, it's still a prison. So not only are we told that God creates a beautiful home for Adam and Eve, but we're also told that he creates a way out, and it appears to be in the form of a tree. Here is something I've often heard said. God put the tree in the garden to test Adam and Eve, or even to tempt them. But as it says in James 1:13, God is not tempted, nor does he tempt anyone. And so placing a forbidden tree in Eden wasn't a test, like some sort of sick experiment where Adam and Eve were lab rats. Some may say, well, if it wasn't a test, why would God put the tree in the garden to begin with? Because what's the use of a door if you can't use it? What's the use of an exit if you can't find it? The freedom to leave or choose a different thing than God had to not only exist, but be within reach for the human beings for them to be truly free. Another thing which tells us something about God and about his covenant with humans. This whole eventful first week on earth comes to a crescendo on the seventh day of the week. This is the conclusion to creation. And what a conclusion it is. First of all, it is spent resting. All that good, productive, useful, amazing work God did, and it all leads to rest. Not only that, but the Sabbath was the first full day which Adam and Eve experienced being alive. Yes, they were charged to rule, but the order of things seems to be they rest first and then they work. Not the other way around as we're used to in our world, where some work for the weekend or work so they can earn rest. And a final note here. The story says that God himself rested. But does God need rest? Is this resting done for a greater reason than to cure tiredness? This certainly warrants a deeper study in another class. But for now, let's move on. It is at this point in the story that we arrive at Genesis 3, and we're going to read what happens next. Genesis 3, verses 1 to 14. Now the serpent was more crafty than any wild animal which Adonai God had made. He said to the woman, "Did God really say you're not to eat from any tree in the garden?" The woman answered the serpent, We may eat from the fruit of the trees of the garden, but about the fruit of the tree in the middle of the garden, God said, "You are neither to eat from it nor touch it, or you will die." The serpent said to the woman, "It is not true that you will surely die, because God knows that on the day you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." When the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it had a pleasing appearance, and that the tree was desirable for making one wise, she took some of its fruit and ate. She also gave some to her husband, who was with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they realized that they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together to make themselves loincloths. They heard the voice of Adonai God walking in the garden at the time of the evening breeze. So the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of Adonai God among the trees in the garden. Adonai God called to the man, "Where are you?" He answered, "I heard your voice in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid myself." He said, "Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree from which I ordered you not to eat?" The man replied, "The woman you gave to be with me, she gave me fruit from the tree, and I ate." Adonai God said to the woman, "What is this you have done?" The woman answered, "The serpent tricked me, so I ate." Adonai God said to the serpent, "Because you have done this, you are cursed more than all livestock and wild animals. You will crawl on your belly and eat dust as long as you live. I will put animosity between you and the woman, and between your descendant and her descendant. He will bruise your head, and you will bruise his heel." Genesis 3 describes a crisis in this story. Something goes wrong, which changes the initial direction of the story, which was everything is good, everything is very good. And Adam and Eve choose to use the exit door. They choose something else than God. They choose to break the terms of his covenant with them. And when people break covenants or deals with us, what tends to happen? Well, usually our relationship with them changes, right? We stop trusting them or dealing with them, or we ask them to leave, or we don't talk to them in the same way anymore. So, what then happens next in this story after the human beings break their covenant with God? Remember the list of things we could deduce about God from the text: powerful, creative, providing. How are these characteristics going to change now that his relationship with Adam and Eve has changed? Well, let's have a look at how God acts. How is he going to react to this crisis? One of the first acts God does after Adam and Eve break their relationship is this. Adonai God made clothes of skin for Adam and his wife and clothed them. A consequence of Adam and Eve's actions has been that shame came over them for the very first time. And they tried to hide their nakedness both from each other and from God. But, quite strikingly, one of God's first acts is not to shame them or add to the shame they're feeling, but to clothe them. The one who was providing at the beginning of the story seems to still be providing. Post-crisis, post-covenant breaking. Okay, that is unexpected. And his other act is found in Genesis 3:15. God makes a promise. Adonai God said to the serpent, "Because you have done this, you are cursed more than all the livestock and wild animals. You will crawl on your belly and eat dust as long as you live. I will put animosity between you and the woman, and between your descendant and her descendant. He will bruise your head, and you will bruise his heel." Interestingly, when people translate this, they often write, "He will bruise your heel, and you will crush his head." But it's the same word in Hebrew, crush and crush. The second promise of 3:15, "I will put enmity or animosity between you, the serpent, and the woman," meaning I will put conflict. Now, a conflict suggests a fight. It's not all that are born of a woman are defeated by the serpent forever. God is saying, I am giving you a fighting chance. Even though your hearts are being changed to be selfish, I will put a fight in you, something else, something not selfish, something that pushes against the mere self-serving voice, something that's proof that there's more than just selfishness and hatred, but there's something more in the world. And back to the heel and head promise. You can survive with a crushed heel. You cannot survive with a crushed head. Meaning there is going to be damage on both sides and pain, but the one who God promises, this descendant of Adam and Eve, who will come crushing the serpent's head, will win. Here, God is telling his enemy that man will not be defeated despite the damage done. So, at the end of this catastrophe, where what God has made good is now being poisoned by human beings, we can deduce one more thing about God from this story. Notice he didn't start again. He didn't wipe the slate clean, eliminate all he'd made, and just start again. Oh, how many times I wished that he had. He could have just deleted the whole world and tried again. But here we learn something else about God. God moves to restore instead of erasing. He heals instead of leaving behind. Instead of walking away, he sticks to something and fights for it. It seems that even in the first chapters of the Bible, we are told a lot about this character of God. But only time will reveal the truth of things. We have come to the end of the Edenic Covenant because Adam and Eve have broken it, but there's a lot more story ahead of us. And so the question hangs in the air. The humans have broken the covenant. So what will God do next? Well, we'll have to find out next time when we look at the next section of our course called the Abrahamic Covenant, which is a truly mind-blowing class. Thank you all for coming to this introduction of covenant theology, and I can't wait to continue to learn with you all. See you next time for part 2.